Well, good morning or good afternoon and welcome everybody. You are here with PLMA. My name is Judy Knight, and this is a load management dialogue where you will discover practitioner perspectives on flexible load management, demand response, distributed energy resources, and managed charging. Today's session is a discussion with industry expert Doug Houseman and our PLMA Global Load Management co-chairs, one of whom is Michael Brown, who will serve as our moderator and will introduce you around. And to get started on this very interesting topic, let me turn the presentation over to Michael, who will introduce our experts and our guests and get the conversation started. So, Michael, I'm going to say the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Judy, and welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today to have a conversation about evolving distribution system operator models. One of the most important objectives of PLMA as an organization is to share best practices and lessons learned about load flexibility and load management. And so the Global Load Management Interest Group works to bring international perspectives in case studies and lessons learned to PLMA membership. I'm joined here today with a few other Global Load Management Interest Group co-chairs. We have Ross Balmy of Balmy Energy Consulting. We have John Hilowitz of Orange and Brockland Utilities and Scott Coe of Grid Optimize. And we have to say we have the pleasure and honor to have a conversation with Doug Houseman. Doug works with 1898 and Company. He's a senior management consultant there. And he just brings an extensive background in energy and utilities. A little bit about Doug. He attended the United States Naval Academy, where he studied naval architecture. And then after early roles in the power industry, he joined a large multinational consulting company, ultimately becoming the CTO of a 12,000 person energy practice. So Doug has a lot of experience ranging from running high growth organizations to working with clients around the world, helping them develop long-term strategic plans and implement innovative solutions. And very interesting fact, his resume includes volunteering in Sierra Leone, assisting in a countrywide plan to recover from the Civil War. Doug is also highly active with industry organizations, including providing trainings for IEEE Power and Energy Society. And Doug was named a top 25 newsmaker by Engineering News Record in 2019, among many other awards that are too long to list here today. So Doug has prepared a presentation where he's going to attempt to distill a very complex discussion into a high-level overview of DSO models and global trends. And then after Doug has presented his material, his thoughts, his observations, we're going to roll into a conversation with the co-chairs and with you. So as you're listening, please be sure to type in your questions into the chat. And we'll do our best to answer those. So now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Doug. Doug, take it away.
Thank you. So when I worked on the smart grid conceptual model for NIST, one of the things we talked about back in 2006, 2007 was the whole idea of not only wholesale markets and wholesale operations, but distribution markets and distribution operations. Those conversations continued through about 2020 when we saw the beginnings of the distribution system operator, DSO, being seriously talked about, not only in the United States, but even more seriously in parts of Europe. And a DSO is an analog to an ISO, independent system operator, a transmission system operator, TSO, or a regional transmission operator, RTO. And while there are small differences between those three types of organizations, the important thing is that they take over the day-to-day operation, both of forecasting and of actual operations of the transmission system and the generators connected to them. Now, in the case of California, when California started talking about a DSO, it was the California ISO that brought that up, and they proposed that they be the one to operate the DSO in California. While you look at a place like the Netherlands, the decision was to take the regional electric companies, essentially the distribution companies that owned the assets, and have them run the DSO and put a Chinese wall in place between non-DSO related operations and the DSO itself, so that some things did not cross that wall. DSO is a new enough actual concept that a lot of things can happen, and we haven't settled down on one model. Similar to what we've done with MISO and the New York ISO and the California ISO. They each have different duties and responsibilities. Now, if you make the DSO independent, then obviously you create a brand new entity from scratch, like we created the California ISO and PJM and Tenet and other transmission operators in different parts of the world. Also, we haven't settled yet on whether there's a retail market to go with the DSO and if that's part of the DSO entity or separate. And obviously, we have everything from retailers to aggregators to transactive energy that could be used as a base to create that retail market. We're looking at DSOs because some people think that the distribution company is favorable to one or another organization, especially when we talk about areas where the TSO, the distribution, the marketing, and so on and so forth are subsidiaries of a single organization. And a big part of what we're trying to do with the DSO is to remove any last vestiges of market power for setting the price on the energy that's moving through the grid. So as we look at, say, FERC 2222, we may not build a new distribution market, but rather bid distribution connected resources into the existing wholesale market. And it's important to think about the different permutations that we can create in creating a distribution system operator from the different laws and rules that happen in different parts of the world that already exist, and from the potential things that could exist that have been proposed by many academic and consulting organizations. Next slide, please. So when we look at creating a DSO, obviously we're going to impact operations. We're going to revise what distribution actually does. We may or may not create a retail market And we're going to end up monitoring customers far more closely than we have in the past as they participate in what's going on. And obviously, the legislature makes decisions on what that DSO might do. And then the regulator actually creates the rules that those entities, be they Chinese walled or completely independent, so that they know how to operate, what information they can pass back and forth, and so on and so forth. Next. So when we look at an independent or TSO or type model, we're going to have to duplicate many of the systems, and I've just listed a few here. Probably the only thing that you may not have to duplicate is the billing system between the distribution company and the distribution system operator. DSOs typically operate on a fee per kilowatt or kilowatt hour, depending on whether or not their demand charges or not to go with the kilowatt hour fees, energy fees. The DSO typically does not take ownership of the actual grid assets that stays with the regional electric company or REC or distribution company, whichever term you prefer to use. And the crews and the fleet vehicles typically belong to the REC or distribution company, but they're dispatched by the DSO. The DSO has the final say in pretty much everything that goes on. Now, a regional electric company or REC is a divorce from the transmission and generation. It has a full set of systems typically. It owns, and before the DSO comes into place, operates the grid. If the REC is the DSO, then again, there's some things that are firewalled off between the actual owner and the REC, and could either operate on a return on invested capital basis or a cost plus model, depending on the decisions that are made by the legislature and implemented by the regulator. Next slide. So if we look at this are a few high-level DSO functions. The ones that are here with an X typically move regardless of what model we use. The ones with the question marks are typically either retained by the REC or are moved to the DSO. The more complete the DSO is, the more of these question marks become part of the DSO. The only things that are really off limits to the DSO at this point from the laws and regulations around the world are the actual ownership of the assets and the ownership of the fleet assets. There are some proposed Asian DSOs where even the field crews would transfer to the DSO. But that's likely to be fairly unique to one or two markets that are thinking about forming. So as you can see, all of operations, day ahead, day after, day before, all planned and unplanned outages belong to the DSO. Planning, protection and loading, forecasting, If there's a retail market, it typically belongs to the DSO. And all of the meter reading belongs to the DSO. And the DSO then is responsible for making data available to the distribution company, any retailers, any third parties that operate from metering data, any aggregators. If you're in a FERC 2222 type market, the DSO would be responsible for providing data to the transmission operator as part of FERC 2222, or as I like to say it so I don't trip up on it, FERC 2x4. Now, as you look at vegetation management, because there's potentially some planned outages involved, at least the operational portion of where can I cut today tends to move to the DSO in a fully fledged DSO. Next. So we're going to look at some countries. The colors here just try to help highlight the different countries I'm going to talk about. This is not everybody that's out there, but this is a pretty reasonable set of countries and states to look at to understand what they're doing. So on this particular slide, colors just mean they're in the sample that we're going to talk about. On the future slides, each color by how dark or light it is, with the exception of the very last slide, tells you how much impact that particular characteristic has on that particular country or state. Next slide. So when we look at how much behind the meter generation there is, Australia by a vast majority has more behind the meter generation and storage than any other country. There's some states in Australia that are well beyond 30% behind the meter generation. And in some places, some communities, it's up to 40% of the storage on the grid. So they have a very different way of operating. They're in the process of setting up the DSO. They're also in an election cycle in Australia. So what the DSO will look like will end up being decided by who runs the government in Australia. California has a fairly large amount of behind the meter generation. Both the Netherlands and Germany are catching up with that. Of course, in California, for anything under about 100 kilowatts, there is no communication with the utility. There is no gross metering. It's purely net metering. And so as California achieves about 10% behind the meter generation, that is for whoever becomes the distribution system operator, and the Cal ISO would like to be that entity, an inability to see or control that generation other than in a net fashion. And with the currently deployed metering systems in California, mostly 4 to 8 hours after the generation is actually created and sent out. Hawaii isn't here, but what may happen in California and potentially even in Australia as that continues to grow and there's no communication is to move to Hawaii's decision that you can put in new solar, but you may not export that solar onto the grid. And I would not be surprised if that didn't happen. Spain has a very large amount of in front of the meter utility scale solar and wind. And there are days in the spring in Spain where they have to shut down or curtail all the other generation in Spain and then go further and curtail wind in order to be able to stay in a controllable situation. California can also run almost purely on renewables during portions of the day. The Netherlands is in a situation where they can as well. In the UK, they operate mostly on offshore wind power at this point, mostly coming from Scotland. So there's a significant price difference between what happens in Scotland and what happens in southern England because of the congestion of the transmission. And you even see in some cases where in the Netherlands there is constriction on the distribution line because there isn't enough capacity. Now, the rules in the Netherlands are different than almost anywhere else because they have to gross meter. They can use the meter in the inverter. And they also have to be able to provide an ability for the utility to throttle or shut down the solar in order to keep the voltage within range. Next slide, please. So California runs for most residential customers who aren't on the CARE program, which is their low income program, 40 to 65 cents per kilowatt hour. So there's some significant considerations for how do we manage the cost of net metering and other things of that sort. The California Public Utility Commission found that up to a third of the residential bill is subsidy for solar batteries and wind in California, the way the market operates. The UK and Germany have rates that can go up to about 30 cents, except for retailers who are putting people on real-time pricing. Then you get to see some negative pricing, but you also see pricing that can be upwards of $3 or $4 a kilowatt hour. Spain, Australia have medium rates, and because of the amount of hydro in British Columbia and Ontario, those rates tend to be 10 to 13 cents. If we were to talk about Quebec and their patrimony, you could get down to 4.8 cents because of the amount of hydro that Hydro-Quebec has. But as you start to look at this and you start to think about a DSO, moderating and managing prices, especially with flex load or VPPs, are going to be important to manage that price that is charged in a particular area. Electricity de France, which operates in Germany, the UK, Spain, and most of the other countries in the EU, has about 15 gigawatts of VPP at this point that they can deploy depending on what the day ahead prices or the spot prices are in the market. Next slide. Here's where it gets to be fun. In Texas, California, and Australia, you can see negative prices from noon to 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon local time, and nighttime prices that might be as much as $1,200 to $3,000 a megawatt hour at night. And that's one of the things that the DSOs are going to have to start helping to figure out is how do we reduce the amount of swing between daytime and nighttime and even seasonal from spring prices to winter prices. As we build more and more solar assets on either side of the meter, we have more and more swing that's involved in those retail prices. And one of the problems that we run into if we don't have storage in the right places or flexible loads that can be turned on to accept energy is the congestion pricing, both for distribution where it exists and transmission, can be much higher during the daytime than it is at night. California statewide has already curtailed almost a terawatt hour in 2025, most of it at the transmission level, but for some installations in the 200 kilowatt and larger, it's been at that level on some of the distribution circuits because they've come to their hosting capacity limit. And a DSO will have to take a look at hosting capacities and make a decision on what they're going to allow to interconnect to not overload or cause undue curtailment of resources on distribution lines. It's going to become, for most states, a real problem sometime between now and 2050, because we're not going to be able to build enough capacity in the grid to be able to support unlimited solar and also to be able to support other things of that sort. Next slide. So here's an idea from 2024 on the International Energy Agency of how many watts of wind and solar are installed on grids. And if you look, Australia's almost to the left-hand line. And then you look down to the other end, and we've got Brazil with about a quarter of the installation that we have in Sweden. Now, realize that capacity isn't the only factor here. The actual capacity factor for solar runs between about 13% efficiency over the day-night in Germany for a capacity factor, and a capacity factor of 22% in Australia. So a watt of solar installed in Australia produces almost twice as much energy over the course of a year as one in Germany does. So You need to be aware of that when you're looking at what the capacity is and what might happen. And of course, if we go up to Ottawa in Ontario, Ottawa Hydro produces 1/10 the kilowatt hours in December that they produce in June from a kilowatt of solar installed properly in Ottawa. So that seasonal swing is another thing the DSO is going to have to deal with on the circuits. Can we see the next slide, please? So when we start looking at demand response, whether it's in thermostat load or industrial shedding or whatever, you're looking at Florida Power and Light having about 20% of their residential load as a flex, while the UK has about 10% of their load as a flex. Now, in many cases in the UK, we're not talking about residences, we're talking about commercial and industrial buildings. In the Netherlands, it's some of both. In Germany, it's primarily industrial and commercial. There are some thermostat programs, but they're not as well developed as you see in Florida or in California or in Texas. And Texas has actually rolled out some significant goals for more flex load. Next slide, please. So another issue that you see are the various countries capable of being fairly self-sustaining. California is not. At night, they can draw as much as 50% from outside of state in order to maintain voltage. New York State draws from Quebec fairly heavily. The UK draws from France through a couple of connectors under the sea. And they're building several new connectors. Germany, again, draws heavily from France. Spain is fairly light on the need to import from others. So as you're thinking about things as a DSO, are the imports less costly than running some level of flex load? And one of the issues that you're going to have to do in a DSO is figure out what each program costs, whether it's importing energy into a particular area or turning things off or turning on a load to balance things or whatever you might want to do. But flexible load is going to be a very important thing for DSOs to be able to do. The big problem is going to be figuring out how much it costs. Next slide. So when we start looking at winter reserve margin, the countries in the dark color here have plenty of reserve margin, including their imports. Next slide. All right, here we've changed things up a little bit. California and Spain are looking at independent DSOs. In the case of California, the ISO is pushing to put the DSO under the California ISO. Their argument is that it will make dealing with FERC 901, FERC 841, 842, 845, and 2222 easier to deal with. Spain's argument for an independent DSO is that there's massive amount of market power in the countries or in the existing distribution companies. And so they would be much better off to put in an independent DSO. In the Netherlands, the DSOs are all the incumbent distribution companies like Alliandra. In the UK, they're taking the 12 regional electric companies and looking at standing up their DSOs in each of those 12 regions. In Australia, as I said earlier in my conversation, we're likely looking at the outcome of the election determining what it's going to be. New York just recently introduced Volume 5 of their plan. Volume 2 was sort of, we're going to do an independent DSO, maybe through the New York ISO. Volume 3 opens that decision back up again. Next slide, please. Michael, I'll turn it back over to you.
Doug, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. We're going to roll into the conversation now, and we're going to leverage our co-chairs here. Scott Coe is going to kick us off with some questions and observations.
Thank you, Doug. Let me ask a comparison question between Europe and the U.S. There are a lot of parallels because we have multiple countries in Europe all under the EU, and we have multiple states all under the federal government here. The difference is that it seems like in Europe they have a slightly more unified approach with this new DSO entity project going on, whereas here in the States the distribution is really completely regulated by the individual states. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on how we can better coordinate here in the U.S., especially with all the different designs we have with verticals, retail choice, non-retail choice, different permutations here in the U.S.?
Well, in the first place in the EU, there's legislation moving all the EU countries toward a DSO model. But when you look at the model in Spain versus the model in Netherlands, they are radically different in how they operate and who runs them. So I'm not even sure the EU ruling on the requirement for a DSO is going to get us to something uniform. In the US, there are enough regulatory state entities that are unhappy enough about what FERC has been doing on the bulk system that impacts or uses the ISO to push rules down to the distribution system. And there is no federal legislation, and likely won't be, that I think we'll be lucky if we get to 20 states that have DSOs by 2050. By 2050, we should at least have something resembling a DSO across most of, if not all, the EU countries. Poland and a couple of the other Eastern European countries are frankly ignoring the EU ruling at this point. So even there, we may not get a DSO in every country.
Great, thank you. John, why don't you step in? You've posted a question, and maybe that's a good one to lead into.
Great, yeah, thanks, Scott. Thanks, Doug. Great presentation. So as a utility member here, just a couple of questions logistically. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is how the DSO's operational budget is really established. How do the ratepayers pay for this? And I assume this is going to be a little bit different for each individual country and entity, but is this something that ends up on a utility bill that the ratepayer is paying that way and then distributed back to the DSO?
It's likely going to be a percentage or an amount per kilowatt hour that gets added as a tax and will end up on the utility bill. So yes, putting a DSO in place is going to raise the cost. The big question is, how do I establish an initial budget? Right now, it seems to be a game of hand grenades. How big a blast radius can you get? Okay, that's my starting budget. Nobody has a good figure right now for what it takes to get a DSO up and running and then how much to operate it. I've heard the California ISO talk about it will be similar to what they currently charge for wholesale market. But when you look at the complexity of what's potentially going to be involved, I'm guessing it's going to be a 10x increase in fee over what most of the ISOs charge. If we remember going from not nodal to nodal, ERCOT's fees went up by a factor of 5 to deal with nodals. Now we're talking about every substation, and there are a lot more substations than there are nodes in most ISOs or TSOs. So by the time you look at the metering that needs to be deployed and the amount of data that needs to be backhauled and the communications and the other things there, I could see an independent DSO in California costing anywhere from half a penny per kilowatt hour to 4 cents a kilowatt hour. But California is a special case.
Great. Thank you very much, Doug. I will turn the next one over to Ross.
Thanks, John. Doug, I want to maybe change this up a little bit. I'd like to see what your thoughts are. When we deregulated the market in Texas, there were some pretty rigid restrictions about what businesses the distribution companies could be in. I mean, they could not be in the retail business, right? But as the market evolved, and how should we be thinking about like who actually owns the utility brand? Is the utility brand owned by the shareholder, or is it owned by the ratepayer? And what I mean by that is, I remember when they were trying to set up shopping services, for commodity shopping services in Texas, at least one of the utilities wanted to brand it as their parent brand, and the retailers were complaining about about market power. How do you think, as the market develops here, we should be thinking about that aspect of branding?
Okay, so TXU, which is the company you're talking about, eventually split into 3 entities. There was TSU, which was the retailer. There was Luminant, who was the generator, and Encore, who became the distribution operator. That also meant that TXU and Luminant both went bankrupt after they taking those companies private into those markets. So TXU eventually got sold to another company to be the retailer, but they're still branded TXU. Luminant got reorganized, and Encore continues to operate as the regulated business. There are in many countries in Europe hard requirements, but they'd already split into a generation company, a wires company, and a retailer, and in most cases changed the names of all of those entities back when deregulation at the wholesale market happened. So I think we'll see more breakup of companies, but under, and this is what happened in the Netherlands, a parent company held most of the subsidiary companies under the new names. And so they continued to span the whole business. It was just with different legal entities under that holding company. So I would expect much of the DSO to happen in a holding company way, even if they are forced to be independent, so long as they conform to the franchise territory of the existing countries. In Spain, there's going to be one uniform DSO. In California, the goal is one uniform DSO. So you couldn't hold that uniform DSO in the existing company as a subsidiary because it goes beyond the franchise territory of that company.
Thank you. Michael,
Okay, sure.
back to you.
Yeah, Doug, I'm going to distill some themes of questions that have come through, and that, of course, we have ourselves about enabling load flexibility and more demand response to help solve some of the challenges that you highlighted. And so I guess it's kind of a two-part question. The first part is you mentioned there may or may not be a market, and around the world we've seen some pilots and emerging local flexibility markets. So I was wondering if you could provide some overview and your understanding of what is a local flexibility market, and then perhaps roll into the second part of the question, which would be what are the most important features or aspects or approaches or things that a DSO could do, or how it could be structured to enable load flexibility, right? Is a market really required, or is it, a different approach, programs and tariffs, and how that would roll out? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, let me start by saying, regardless DSO or not DSO, as we add more variable generation, we're going to need more demand side management. We're not going to be able to do it all with batteries. That's not affordable. The second thing I'm going to say is we're going to have to pick a communications method. And I don't care whether it's IEEE 2030.5 or Matter or Modbus, but we need to pick one, because we're going to need to simplify the installation and the operation of load management devices. We had Zigbee, and over Zigbee, we ran the Smart Energy Protocol, and we got maybe 0.2% of devices that could have played involved in that particular market. Today we've got Wi-Fi, we understand Wi-Fi, and what we've got to do, the most important thing that we've got to do, is we've got to make it transparently easy for customers to decide to participate. Let me explain what I mean. My mother doesn't understand load management at all, but she understands I want to be comfortable and I want to save money. So where do I put that slider between comfortable and save money? And so long as we can get there with our residential and small commercial and industrial customers, we can probably run more programs. But it's got to be a simple communication so that we can build very cheap silicon and tie that into existing Wi-Fi so that for the customers, it's a very simple decision. And for appliance manufacturers, HVAC manufacturers, it is a simple, cheap decision to install it in their white goods coming out. It's really hard, but we're going to have to do it to figure out what it actually costs and what the incentives need to be for a demand side management program. Because what's going to be expected by the regulators, and DSO or not DSO, is are you pulling the trigger on your lowest cost option? In many cases, demand side management, load management, VPP is your lowest cost. But we're going to have to be able to prove it in our rate cases, and the DSO is going to have to be able to approve it. If you look at the approach that Southern California Edison made with the grid management system, 1/8 of the requirements for that system were economics. Right now, even DERMS does not have a good handle on economics. And that's a piece that we're going to have to figure out in order to make load management more pervasive and more used. And I probably only partially answered your question, Michael, because it was a big question.
That's all right. I think we've got interesting questions coming through in the chat for our conversation, and Scott's going to serve up another one for us.
Yes, we have Danielle Murray asked a question that I'll generalize here a little bit, which is the size of these DSOs, especially when we're talking about maybe ERCOT or California ISO running a DSO. Would you expect them to be statewide, or would they be the size of traditional utilities, or is it somewhere in between those two? What's your thought on the scale of these to make operations more efficient, reserve sharing, energy sharing, those sorts of things?
So the current governor in California and the California ISO wants a single statewide system. In ERCOT, while ERCOT has talked about running a statewide DSO, you're seeing the utilities argue for traditional service territory. Now, where that gets to be interesting is when you start talking about munis and co-ops. There's some fairly large munis and co-ops in Texas, and there are some fairly small munis and co-ops in Texas. What Connecticut is talking about is having the larger utilities team up with the co-ops in the munis to make a single DSO and to deal with cybersecurity for that group of entities rather than making every entity do its own thing. Remember, we've got roughly 5,000 total utility companies in North America, of which about 120 are large. And I'm including Canada in that, and the rest of them are much smaller. So you take a town like Stevenson, Michigan, which is a muni. They've got 85 customers. How do they stand up a DSO? They can't. They've got one employee. So it very quickly devolves into you're going to have to gang the smaller with the larger in order to get to an economic operating area. My calculations based on looking at what has to be done is somewhere between 3 and 5 million customers makes a good DSO size.
Great rule of thumb and great answer. Judy, are you prepping
I think
next?
it's time to
I think it's
thank
time to start
Doug.
wrapping up. Thank you, Michael and Scott.
Yeah.
And Doug, thank you very much. This is a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate you joining us today. And of course, I want to send a big thank you to the Global Load Management Group and the co-chairs of that group who you've been listening to along with Doug. And that's Michael Brown, Ross Malmy, John Hillowitz, and Scott Coe. Thanks, guys. Great work today. Let me quickly remind everybody that you can watch a recording of this presentation on PLMA's YouTube channel, and you can also download it from wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Load Management Dialogues, and we encourage you to listen to that. Wanted to also let you know that Global Load Management will be hosting a very interesting session that continues this discussion at the PLMA conference in Kansas City, which is coming up on May the 5th. Hope you will join us to continue the conversation and to do some more exploration of where we can go with the DSO idea. And of course, if you haven't yet registered for the conference, we encourage you to do so. Good news is you are in time if you book today to get the last day of the special hotel prices. So by all means, do that if you are able to. We'd love to see you in Kansas City. And the last thing I want to let you know about is, whoops, we're going the wrong direction. Let's go in the other direction. We have one more webinar before we get to Kansas City, and this will be tomorrow. You can register for it. It is for PLMA members only, and it is all about electric vehicles. It's being hosted by our electric transportation interest group, and we're looking forward to hearing from them. So thank you very much, everybody, for a really terrific conversation today. We appreciate your time and your attention. And let me just say quickly in summary, you've been listening to a load management dialogue presented by PLMA. To learn more about upcoming dialogues, please visit PLMA's calendar at flexload.org or your favorite podcast platform. And this concludes this edition. Good afternoon, everyone.